At Old Mutual, we have weathered many storms over the past 175 years, and our financial position remains strong and resilient enough to withstand the toughest of times. Over the last few months, our response to the pandemic has been focused on partnering with our key stakeholders on initiatives to drive a positive and significant impact during these challenging times. We are privileged and honored to be able to continue supporting those who have always supported us.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion. Today, our discussion is going to focus on the manufacturing sector and effectively how do we chart the course post-COVID to help the sector recover. Today, I have a number of esteemed panelists with me. I'm going to do a brief introduction of all of them, and then we will get into the questions. So first up, we have Mr. Victor Radebe, who is the founder of Mzansi Aerospace Technologies. He's also a founder of the Mobility Center for Africa. And given some of the challenges that he had seen in the last mile logistics sector, it's part of the passion and what he would like to contribute to solving within South Africa. Next up, we have Mr. Godwin Sam Ngoma, who is the head of learning and development and external affairs at Castel Malawi. He's played a number of roles, but is also well experienced in a number of topics such as economic policy design, project management, and analysis as well. We also have another panelist, Mrs. Tsakani Tsitsabi Mushoga, who is a general manager with Old Mutual, leading the customer solutions in the Mass and Foundation cluster. She brings 17 years of financial experience with her, but is also responsible for transforming the current cluster that she's leading. Finally, but by no means leastly, we have Professor Fiona Tregena, who is the South African chair in industrial development and is a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg. She holds a number of degrees, but she also brings a lot of experience in a number of topics, particularly around industrialization. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
As you'd all be aware, I think COVID has created a number of challenges, and I think South Africa in particular has been feeding those. And it's almost compounding. And I guess if you look at the manufacturing sector particularly, that is probably one sector that has felt the brunt of it the most. But at the same time, it also offers a lot of opportunity for South Africa. I think the shift to localizing some of our supply, the need for some of the major corporates to change their supply chains and switching to local suppliers is a major opportunity. And it gives an opportunity for both economic growth, but also from an employment perspective as well. The manufacturing sector is no doubt one of the biggest contributors to the economy, and certainly an area that deserves a fair amount of attention as well. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, and Victor, I'm going to direct it at you. And if we started off, if we think about, the added demand and growth potential for products, and it gives us a chance to rebound after the crisis. How do you see these sort of business opportunities for manufacturers playing out?
No, thanks, Sujith, and thanks for inviting me to this manufacturing endeavor. And I believe before maybe I answer that question, we just got to look at what are the major drivers that we are facing in this country, and that will pan out also for the rest of the decade. One of our biggest problems is urbanization, rapid urbanization. I live in a province where annually we're getting about 1 million people coming into this province. Sorry, about 250,000 people coming into this province every year, from the rest of the continent and from the rest of the country. And this province, the last census in 2016, it was 15.8. We're going to breach probably the 20 million mark by the next census. And if you look at where the demand is from a manufacturing point of view, for me, in the transportation space, because it's affected by urbanization, and climate change is another one. I mean, we just come out of COP26, whereby things are going green. I mean, we have a very strong automotive manufacturing sector in South Africa. However, this needs to be repurposed. I mean, we've been having discussions with NAMSA and government to a large extent, where they're saying they're not taking EVs seriously, electric vehicles. But Europe is not going to buy our cars in 2035, and we export cars to those countries. US is not going to buy those cars. China's not going to buy those cars. We have an opportunity right now to beneficiate some of the minerals that this continent has, that go into the value chain, the manufacturing supply chain of electric vehicles. We have that opportunity. In fact, I can't think of an industry or sector better than the automotive industry. It is our crown jewel. You speak to DTIC, it is our crown jewel. We have probably the best example of industrialization. I mean, we produce cars, we export 60% of them. Some of the finest cars are made in South Africa for the export market. So we need to probably do more in this. By probably going more into component manufacturing, not only by the way in the four-wheelers, because that is the whole emphasis. We got to go two-wheelers, because the e-commerce is exploding, and you've seen what has happened within the two-wheelers. We're going to go, if government has to put money, I would say, hey, put money in that space. But the big drivers is urbanization, climate change, and the whole miniaturization of mobility, which is going two-wheel. And if it goes two-wheel, in South Africa, we're seeing that boom happening. And the nice thing about two-wheelers is that they don't need as much infrastructure as the four-wheelers. And it's probably an area that we can exploit as a nation, not only for ourselves, but for the rest of the continent, because micromobility is something that will boost manufacturing. I mean, I was speaking to one of the suppliers of these two-wheelers that are going into the last mile deliveries in the scooter space. I mean, they can't keep up with demand, and that demand, we know the auto industry was hit by COVID. But for the two-wheelers, the demand is on an upward slope. And it's easier there for us to be able to go manufacturing than in the four-wheel space. So I would say, let's learn from the auto industry and build everything around it, because it's got a lot of value chain. Auto industry is just about everywhere. It's in tourism, it's in mining, it's in all these spaces. And I believe that it is one sector wherein we can play a major role. Thank you.
Sure. And Victor, maybe just building on that point, would you say it's also about the enabling, the incentives and the structure of the sector that's critical to building it? And are you saying then that we learn from that and select other industries that we apply the same sort of approach to?
Look, the industry, I think going to the times of Minister Rob Davies, we've been able to enabling, because that is what government should be doing. It's been very good at enabling. But what we've got to look at, we've got to say, how can this incentive program be plugged into other industries, particularly within the whole green economy? We know right now that we're sitting with a mineral that nobody will want in the next coming years, coal, and unless it is a big problem for us. But at the same time, I was talking to one guy in the gym today. He's trying to raise funding for a coal mine in Mpumalanga. Nobody wants to touch it. Okay, and we've got to say, hey, what is it? What else can we do? I mean, in the DRC, we've got 50% of the world's cobalt that is sitting there, and we've got to not only look at ourselves. There are opportunities with the Africa Free Trade Agreement that can allow us to work with any of these sectors and do more before the Chinese go in there. In fact, we probably might be late because the rest of the world is going into that space. But we've got to be able. We are here, and we have the Africa Free Trade Agreement. We've got the AU. We probably need to work on building an Africa agenda for manufacturing. But I look at the automotive industry as one industry that from Cape to Cairo, we can change the narrative and build on it in this country.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Victor. Fiona, if I could turn to you and thinking about how then does the manufacturing sector catalyze the recovery for the economy? So I think Victor gave us a great example of the automotive sector, but I guess looking a little more broadly and kind of looking at industrialization as well, where would you see those big opportunities for the manufacturing sector to play a role?
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to be part of the Indaba. Yes, I think the manufacturing sector certainly has a crucial role to play in the recovery, and the recovery which we're talking about is not going to be a quick one. It's going to be an extended one over a period of time. And I think that the role of manufacturing in that goes beyond its direct contributions to GDP and to employment. As important as those direct contributions are, the role is also a catalytic one in terms of the economy more broadly. So an indirect contribution going beyond its direct one. In very broad terms, I think manufacturing and industrialization have a central role to play in the economy's growth as well as that of other developing countries for a couple of reasons. One is the strong linkages between manufacturing and other sectors. So when you have an expansion of demand in manufacturing, it tends to stimulate demand in other sectors. Manufacturing also has an important role to play in innovation and technological upgrading, in economies of scale and so on. So I think even historically, and when we look at other countries around the world, we see the central role of manufacturing and industrialization, where developing countries have been able to catch up with more advanced economies. So turning then specifically to the context of the recovery, which we are grappling with here in South Africa, I think there's a couple of channels and dimensions through which we can look at the role of manufacturing. One is on the employment side. Obviously, employment has been heavily hit during the COVID period, and that's coming off a level of unemployment before COVID that was without doubt at crisis levels, the highest or amongst the highest in the world. So it has only been exacerbated during the time of the pandemic. So while the direct contribution of manufacturing to employment has declined over time, it still employs a number of people. And also there's indirect employment creation through the manufacturing sector. And perhaps one of the aspects that we need to look at in terms of manufacturing employment is the contribution at different levels of employment, high-skilled, low-skilled, and so on, and also thinking in terms of the profile of the unemployed in South Africa. And then obviously there's a value-added contribution as well to GDP. So GDP has still got a long way to go in terms of rebounding, and the manufacturing sector has an important role to GDP and to the balance of payments as well. And I would say some further channels are through innovation and technological upgrading. So there's a kind of, I think, a blurring between the manufacturing and the services sectors in terms of where innovation is actually happening. It depends on the type of innovation. Some of it is happening within firms, in manufacturing firms, some of it within services type firms and so on. But the kinds of R&D and innovation that's happening in manufacturing can actually contribute to technological upgrading and competitiveness across the economy. So that's an example of where there's a broader role to play. And I would say through the linkages. So where we have an expansion in, for example, in manufacturing, it's going to stimulate, let's say, the agricultural sector, and not only kind of agro-processing, which is at the borderline, but more broadly. Similarly with services, there's a lot of blurring of the lines, but a lot of services are dependent on manufacturing, similarly with mining and so on. So there's that broader stimulating role. And maybe the last comment I would say in terms of the recovery is the importance of moving into new spaces. I guess this goes for the economy across the whole, but particularly since we're looking at manufacturing, it's both the enduring focus on where we've got strengths, such as in the auto sector that Victor referred to, as well as trying to build competitiveness in new and growing spaces. And yeah, perhaps we can come back to that later in the discussion.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for your Godwin, given your role, I think you're kind of in the heart of kind of manufacturing, I guess, at the cold face of it in your current role. I think linked to the points that we've just spoken about, I think the economy is changing, the expectations are changing. I think there are a number of methods in which the manufacturing sector can contribute as well. But I think one of the factors we've had to deal with was the continued supply chain interruptions that we have been dealing with. So how do you think manufacturers can look to increasing production for local markets and collaborating with their value chains to expand within those markets? I mean, given your experience with your current firm, what would you say are some of the opportunities there, or how could manufacturers go about doing this?
Very much for having me in this endeavor. Yes, as my colleagues have said, the shock that came in with the COVID indeed brought a hit in the industrialization and the industries, and especially the manufacturing industry. I will talk more on regions and countries which are developing countries. I'll be talking more of examples of Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe. These are countries which are in the SADC region and in the COMESA region. So in terms of what manufacturing can do in anticipation of the continued supply interruption, I will have 4 points that I would want to bring to your attention. The first one, what manufacturers need to do basically is to grow the local supplies. I'm talking this in terms of the SADC region. Most of the manufacturing do import their raw materials. Now, one of the things that interrupted the manufacturing industry was that you found that borders were closed. Some organizations were on lockdown and they could not supply. And hence we had all these problems of the logistics, the transportation and all that. Now, if the companies, the manufacturers are to help and maintain their sustainability, what they need is to start empowering their own local suppliers. That is, come up with a deliberate policies of having localization of raw material, so that if an interruption like this one comes in, a shock that we don't know, but you should still be having suppliers that can supply with locally for you, and you still be in the production. So there is need for manufacturers to think of how they can help the supply chain by managing the local suppliers, encouraging them to be able to grow or develop their raw materials. That is going to help the organizations to be there. Number two is innovations. Innovation is a key thing right now with the manufacturing. There's no manufacturing that is going to go without thinking of renovation, going into the R&Ds in order to see what is the right thing that they need to bring to the market. The shock has showed us that you need to be a vibrant manufacturing, which can engineer at any time. You've seen in Europe, in the US, the automobile companies that were able to re-engineer themselves and started producing pharmaceutical or medical equipment. That's the kind of thing that you need. You need to have manufacturers that are innovative enough, anticipate what is happening, and look into the situation and say, how best can we come in? Basically, what we're saying is they should be able to look at what's the demand out there and how do we supply that demand. So it's a matter of getting the supply and demand equation right. And this will all happen because you are being innovative enough and you're able to bring the right things which are demanded out there. With that, you'll be able to sustain your supply chain, you'll be able to supply your production. The third thing which I would like to bring to attention, basically is the manufacturers need to go what we call hybrid. You will see that with the lockdowns, the manufacturers, most of them suffered because most of the manufacturers still want to use manpower. Therefore, when we are saying lockdown or some people should work at home, manufacturers are positioned, most of them will say, okay, but most of the products that we're doing, we still need manpower to be there. People have got to work in shifts for the production line to still be there. So that brought a disruption because you were in a situation where the demand was not there. You were retrenching and cutting down on staff, and you could not support the same number of people you had. But if you go hybrid, what will happen is you bring in technology and also manpower. So the technology will take up position of the work which was done by the larger manpower, to the extent that you can easily have fewer people working and the technology also hopping in. Because believe it or not, whatever has happened now, the change that has come will not be reversed. We have now found ourselves in a situation where the production lines, which we had a big number of people, we have cut it down. There's no way we're going to have that number again. So what is going to substitute that is the hybrid part, bringing in technology. So industries, manufacturers needs to start thinking of going hybrid, using more of the e-commerce, the technology to help them into their production. That's what is bringing to what is now the most famous wave which is going on, the digitalization. That's the fourth thing that all manufacturing companies need to be thinking of. Let's think of how do we digitalize our processes? How do we digitalize the way we do our business, the way we manufacture things? Is it possible for us to start thinking innovatively and seeing how do we start reducing manpower, bringing in more the digital era and digital things that can help to improve in our work? If you have that in mind, then you pass that to the supply chain, to the whole supply chain of your industry, the way they should do work, the way the things they need to supply you, they should be able things that are going through that kind of process. Then we'll be able to sustain the demand and the manufacturing industry that is there. Thank you.
Godwin, thank you. I think those were great points, but I think just tying back to some of the points that Victor mentioned, but Fiona mentioned as well, we see manufacturing being critical as a catalyst for employment and expanding other areas as well. How then do you balance this against the 2 points that you've raised, right? So you mentioned the hybrid model as an example, so bringing in more technology. You've also mentioned digitalization. How then do you balance that versus playing this catalytic role at the same time? Is it about expanding within the value chains? Is it about building local suppliers? What then would suppliers have to really, manufacturers have to focus on to play this catalytic role that they have?
That's the localization. Once you're doing the localization, basically what you're doing is you are creating and empowering the other industry that supply into you. So instead of relying on imports, you are going to grow your own local raw material suppliers. And in creating that, you're going to create another industry that was not there, but now it's got to be there. Or if it was there, it was dormant, but you now have to start strengthening it. Believe you me, most of the countries that are importing raw material, it doesn't mean that they don't have the local material at home. They've got the local material, but maybe the problem is their standards. Mm-hmm. And that's why they're going to import. You'll be surprised that even others, it's because of the cost. you find that the costs locally are higher than the imports that you get from other countries. Let's say like in Malawi, I'm in the beverage industry here in Castell. You find that the barrel here is more expensive locally than buying them out from South Africa. But if you improve on the local suppliers to have digitalized the way they're doing their business, go hybrid, give them more innovation, encourage them to be innovative, improve on their standards, then there'll be more players that will come into that industry. And that growth of the industry means that more employment is coming in and more players are coming into the market, and you empower the economy as well, because you now have economies that are doing all things that are meeting the required standards. That's how I'll take it.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Godwin. Victor, Godwin made some great points earlier around, with closing of borders and the disruptions from a mobility and a logistics perspective. Any points from you in terms of great innovation or opportunities that you've seen, how manufacturers and maybe logistics providers have collaborated to alleviate the problem?
Sorry. No, I think Gordon raised very, very good points. In fact, I took his 4 points, which are quite important. Yes, there are problems with supply chain now, global supply chains, which are probably bringing us an opportunity for people to think sourcing some of these products locally. Let's just take it in the context of our continent, of our beautiful continent, is that you're faced with suppliers. If you look at the supply chain, you're faced with suppliers who can supply you, okay? But at the same time, they run a business. If they can get a dollar price, and as opposed to a rand price, they'll obviously take the dollar price. We've seen that in the steel industry. We've seen it in the other space. What I think probably needs to do is that there is a need for us to integrate our supply chain so that when you tighten it up, when I say tighten it up, it can happen through vertical integration, whereby manufacturers, they diversify and be able to even take a stake in the mine, for instance. If you want to have a constant supply of a mineral, you're better off vertically integrating it into your business. Otherwise, if it's not vertically integrated, these people will obviously sell to the highest bidder, and that is what they're going to do. But look, we live in the world of information age, and I like your last point of saying let's digitalize. Everything is digitized. One thing that we probably sometimes forgot about when we talk about Africa exporting goods and only for them to come back as finished goods. There is another product that Africa is exporting. And that product is it's actually even far more important than everything else. That is the data and information, the use of the assets that we import, whether it's cars, cell phones, or whatever. And that information is going straight to the owners of the platforms, the owners of the manufacturers, and they get to understand the market much better. And whatever that comes up, a new product, a new iPhone, will be based on how we use the iPhone. A new product that is used in South Africa, a new vehicle, is based on that. And I don't see our local manufacturers taking advantage of all this information and using that information and for us to give us an edge from a global competitiveness. Because everything now is digitized, most assets, whether it's a computer or a car or whatever, they're all connected, and they are generating tons and tons of data that can produce very, very valuable insights into our manufacturing. And we need to link that and say, how do we use this information for us to get ourselves with global competitiveness? But going back to trying to secure supplies, the only way I can think of is where manufacturers, they vertically integrate their businesses to to the suppliers. You can't just say, no, I'm in the automotive industry, I'm in the steel industry, when your supplier is not loyal to you. Probably it means that you need to integrate your business so that you know that if there are problems, I'm not going to be bidding against people buying the same raw materials in dollars. The food industry is a case in point. I spoke to Sujith, I spoke to the president of FARO, a forum for agricultural research in Africa, where he was telling me, say, look, you guys might be worried in the other sectors of manufacturing. The food industry it's a serious problem. You say you've got. He made an example that the 40% of the milk that is drunk in West Africa come from one tiny country called the Netherlands, and he said, by the way, guess where the raw materials came from? They came from the same continent, and this is just the story of our manufacturing. And until such time, people they get angry that, hey, we are importing toothpicks. It's all about the economies of scale and about numbers, not that we can manufacture these things. We're just going to be able to build enough economies of scale so that we can manufacture the same product, probably even if not better quality. But it is all about the numbers game.
Thank you for those points, Victor. Fiona, if I turn to you now and kind of building on those points, right? So I think lots of opportunity. I think Victor made some great points around vertical integration. I think we've heard around digitalization and innovation as well. What would you see as the opportunities that exist for manufacturing as we're emerging from this COVID pandemic, or at least trying to recover from it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think as my fellow panelists, Victor and Godwin, have both mentioned, there were opportunities that arose, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, with the disruption of supply chains and the reconfiguration of global value chains, and also sudden growth in demand for particular products, such as mass PPE. And that's both in the domestic market and internationally. And I think a realistic assessment would be that while there might have been pockets of success in taking up those opportunities, we didn't really see a wide success of South African manufacturers capitalizing on those emerging opportunities, even in the face of all of the challenges here with the lockdowns and so on. And I think one of the points that underscores is the importance of strong productive capabilities in manufacturing firms in advance. So this will not be the last shock in terms of COVID. There are unfortunately likely to be other things, perhaps not of a similar scale, but there will always be these kind of shocks to the economy. And it's very difficult or impossible, perhaps, to overnight build up very strong productive capabilities in manufacturing. Where you have those strong capabilities in advance, you can adapt. So adaptation is something which we have seen firms around the world doing. And that's why, for example, if we look at manufacturers in China, they were very quickly able to not only to upscale production, but to adapt into different products and so on. So that suggests that, yes, overnight adaptation matters, but what allows you to adapt is those capabilities. And that's in terms of technologies, it's in terms of human resources, it's in terms of the way production is organized, and so on. And those are things that are built up over time. Partly, primarily through the efforts of the firm, but also with appropriate industrial policy and other support. So it points to the importance of a strong manufacturing sector on an ongoing basis, a manufacturing sector which is, even if not at the technological frontier, but at least competitive, which is nimble and adaptable, and so on. In terms of perhaps specific opportunities that might still be presenting themselves, I think it's clear that maybe first of all, directly associated with the pandemic, there will be ongoing high demand for personal protective equipment, PPE, as well as for vaccines. So in the early stages of the pandemic, we thought that, okay, well, this will be a sort of a relatively quick thing. Yes, people will need masks now, but kind of if you're not producing masks now, well, what's the point of going into it? Because by the time you set up your capabilities, it will be too late. I think looking internationally, it's increasingly clear that even with vaccination and so on, at least some usage of masks will be maintained, at least for the foreseeable future. We don't know how long that will be. So the masks is just one example. But similarly, in terms of vaccines, whilst there's we obviously have some manufacturing capacity in terms of vaccines, it's a bit more sort of on the assembly side, I guess. And even there, I mean, there were discussions in the early stages of the pandemic around, boosting manufacturing capacity in vaccines and so on. And perhaps even there, the sense was like, well, if you can't do it now, kind of, well, it's too late to make serious investments in that now, because by the time you do it, it will be too late. But I think it's, the indications are that vaccines, COVID vaccines will be needed on an ongoing basis, whether it be in terms of booster shots or new vaccines and so on. So it's important to build manufacturing capacity in that, and perhaps manufacturing capacity that is adaptable not only to COVID vaccines, but to related pharmaceutical products where there is a high demand in the country, in the continent, and more broadly. So it suggests that this is something which is worth supporting increased capacity in. And then I think perhaps another aspect of the recovery process that presents some opportunities for manufacturing is the focus on what's been called building back better. So internationally, as well as in South Africa, the view that when we're recovering from COVID and rebuilding the economy, yes, we need to rebuild employment and GDP and so on, but it's not just a question of doing more of the same. And going back to the way things were, but that it's important to also do things in a better and a more sustainable way. So that kind of thinking has led internationally to a focus on, for example, conditionalities, that where support and incentives are provided to manufacturing firms. How is that then tied to more sustainable production, environmentally, as well as more broadly? So I think this links in with the push towards green industrialization, the growing focus on green industrial policy, that whether it be the auto sector or whatever, that where there is support being received, that needs to go hand in hand with the shift towards more environmentally sustainable production. I think linked to this, there's also kind of emerging thinking around what are the connections, let's say, between the healthcare and the public health sector and the manufacturing sector. Obviously, there's always been those connections. There are manufacturing, which is producing not only pharmaceuticals, but medical equipment and so on. But more broadly, what are the connections between manufacturing and the meeting of basic needs and quality of life and so on? And I think there are perhaps emerging opportunities in that regard.
Great, thank you, Fiona. I think that those are great points. I think I particularly like the point around building back better. I think that's a critical aspect. I think with COP26 underway and all the focus at the moment, I think around sustainability and the rest of it, it is a critical factor to keep in mind. I guess maybe as we close, I think kind of last question to the two of you. I will, Victor, I'll hand to you, and then Fiona, maybe close with you as well. Any perspective on how we go about unlocking these opportunities? What is it that's missing that we need to actually be doing to help unlock these opportunities?
Yeah, obviously you must have noticed I'm very biased towards in favor of the transport sector, but it's much broader than that. It's about the supply chains, inbound and outbound, and we in the tip of the southern hemisphere, where we normally are very far from everybody. And sometimes when we want to get the raw materials, we have to streamline the supply chain. But what COVID has brought to us is a very, very, not only brought to us, but it just accelerated it, is the whole e-commerce environment, whereby things are getting digitized and products are moving from manufacturer to end users. But some of them that move to manufacturing plants, the whole e-commerce has just ballooned, and it's taken itself into another level. I mean, if you look at how Tesla sells vehicles, I mean, I like what Fiona is saying, build back better. Do we still need showrooms in the car industry? Do we still need shopping malls when things move from factories? Can't things? E-commerce has shown that the whole disintermediation of some of the infrastructure that probably, yes, it might, there are people that are employed in that space, but if you are able to move goods quicker to customer, it only just improves the competitiveness of manufacturers, because the final product that gets into the customer, at least the manufacturer is going to get a higher share out of it. But we know that the retailers and wholesalers must make money. But if people can get the products and you disintermediate some of the middle persons that are probably only adding cost to the final consumer, it will make manufacturers even much more competitive. I mean, the food industry is the case in point, so that if we want our manufacturers to be competitive to their global counterparts, let's probably shorten the time it takes and streamline the time it takes for a product to move from the factory to the end user. And in doing that, it will build the manufacturing. And yes, we in the transport space, we are at the center of it, but e-commerce and the whole digitization of the supply chain will help in that respect. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Victor. Fiona, any final comments from you around how do we unlock some of these opportunities? And then I'll close with Godwin after that.
I think perhaps one important aspect to emphasize is around the opportunities on other African countries, African markets, and in particular through regional integration. Victor in his comments was referring to our location at the southern tip of Africa and being far from everybody, I guess referring to European and North American and Asian markets. But there are other markets that we are close to and that we need to take advantage of. And I think through the Continental Free Trade Agreement is opening up possibilities for South African manufacturing. And I think while there has been a reorientation or growing orientation towards those markets in recent years, I think there's still a considerable space to expand there. I guess in terms of what else needs to be done, a lot of it is obviously on the firm side in terms of investments, and not only investments in physical infrastructure, but in digital infrastructure, in skills and upgrading and so on, and not always waiting to be kind of threatened by imports and then reacting, but to see how to get ahead of the curve and to threaten others in other markets through increased competitiveness. And then obviously there's an important role for policy support. And part of that is industrial policy, and ensuring that industrial policy is not only well targeted enough, but of a sufficient scale to really make a difference in terms of just the amounts of resources involved and ensuring that it can make a difference. And perhaps my final note on that will be the importance of policy coordination among the various domains. So the kinds of support and enabling environment which is needed for manufacturing firms doesn't, of course, only come from industrial policy. It also comes from education and skills policy, innovation and technology policy, macroeconomic policy, and trade policy and competition policy and so on. And it's important to have better coordination between these so that, for example, exchange rates are competitive enough for exporting, that innovation policy is creating the kind of environment that is conducive for technological upgrading, that education and skills policy is developing the right skills, which then firms can build on to develop their own tailored tailored skills for their particular needs. So perhaps further work is needed in coordination amongst institutions and between policy domains to ensure that the sector can be grown on a sustainable basis.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. Gordon, just in terms of final closing comments, any views from your side on how do you enable this and how do you strengthen the opportunities for manufacturers in a country like Malawi, as an example, or maybe in some of your neighbors as well? Is any kind of closing comments from that perspective?
Yes, indeed, there are opportunities that are there, and the opportunities that the current situation has also brought about. The pandemic has brought a shock to the world, and it has unlocked a lot of people in starting to think and they see things. Looking at the region we're in, the neighboring countries, the COMESA region, and so you find that the manufacturing industry was actually dying. It was dwindling, getting smaller and smaller. But with this coming in, they realized that you need to have strong manufacturing industry within yourself locally. And the opportunities have now come up. Opportunities in the point that now you will have governments that will be listening to the demands and the requirements of the manufacturing industry. I'm looking at the manufacturers coming up now as the right time in which they can make their consent known to the government. We're looking at issues of incentivizations. How do you incentivize companies to come in, manufacturing company, to invest in your country? This is something that has been missing. How do you discuss with the government to see the problems that are making how to do business in your country or in your region to happen? So you're talking about manufacturers, talking of things of cost of production being higher, maybe because of the taxes and things like that, which now they can come in and discuss. So manufacturers should take advantage of the time to start discussing and doing that. The last point I would put on is manufacturers should also start thinking regionally. Fiona is just talking about policies. We've got regional policies which we are coming up. SADC has got policies, COMESA, we are now having the African Free Trade Zone. All these organizations are coming up with policies. Manufacturers themselves will need to be on top of such policies and start discussing with these people to come up with the policies which are favoring the manufacturing. We need to take this opportunity because right now, everybody understands the importance of manufacturing, the need for manufacturing to be there. So we need to start talking regionally. We need to start talking with one voice, even maybe coming up with regional bodies of manufacturing in separate industries, maybe the automobiles, Rwanda automobiles, Africa automobile, forming up a grouping which they can be speaking on one voice. How do we strategize? How do we come up with policies that are going to favor our production to be sold here locally in Africa? That kind of thing is what I would say. There is an opportunity. People have seen our need. Let's take advantage. How do we do that? Let's intensify our talk with the government. Number two, can we manufacturers start forming regional bodies, regional groupings that will be speaking one voice? And in that, we're going to have that integration and do well in the industry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Godwin. So I think at the conclusion of the questions we needed to go through, I just want to summarize some of the points and thank you all for the great contribution and the points that you've raised as well. I think we spoke about rapid urbanization and the changes that we are experiencing and how we need to adapt from a supply chain and manufacturing perspective. We also discussed how important the role is from an indirect, but also from a direct perspective. So whether it be from an employment directly, but also the catalytic effect. And I think Godwin, you raised some great points as well when we spoke about what's the opportunities, and that's around, growing that local supply base, making that bringing it closer to where you need it, is a critical aspect. But a couple of times we've also raised the critical aspects around innovation, R&D. Fiona, you made great points about how do you build the right sort of capacity to actually, make sure that you can do this. So even though the opportunity to shift is there, if you don't have the productive capacity, how do you actually then do it? Which is a critical aspect that needs to then be developed adequately within the country as well. We also had some great points around the context of our region and our economy as well, where we have seen the closing of borders. We do see the better need for integration. And Victor, you spoke about, how do you vertically integrate and how do you start, thinking differently as a manufacturer? Do you just play in your own space, or do you start integrating in a different way to actually secure your supply chain and play differently across the economy as well? And in closing, just thinking about the opportunities, I think a couple of great points that came up. I think the e-commerce aspect and what is the opportunity that exists there? How do you shorten some of those supply chains? And is there a way to reach the customer, I guess, more efficiently in a way? I think this point around regional integration is critical as well, from a policy perspective, but also policy coordination perspective. And then, Godwin, to your closing points, how do manufacturers start influencing that discussion in the right sort of way, right? So how are manufacturers then at the forefront around the discussions around taxes, incentives? And is there then an opportunity to form some sort of regional bodies between the manufacturing sector? If it is that critical, how do you use your voice to then drive the opportunity as well? So thank you all once again. I think those are really great points, and thank you for your time today. Great having you on board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sujith.